Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be with you. So, I'm going to immediately start and give you an introduction to Robert Burns. So, Robert Burns, the famous Scottish poet, was born in 1759, within a few months of Mozart, Robespierre, the French revolutionary, William Blake, the English poet, William Pitt, the English Prime Minister, William Wilberforce, the slavery abolitionist, Mary Wollstonecraft, also born within a few months, the early feminist, and Admiral Lord Nelson. So this is a turning point in history. It's only 14 years since the Battle of Culloden, when a load of Highlanders in kilts ran down a hill shouting, screaming and waving huge swords, and ran straight into the highly disciplined guns of the Duke of Cumberland. But it's only 5 years before, in 1759, it's 5 years only until James Watt is walking on Glasgow Green, and he makes his conceptual breakthrough for the condenser for a steam engine, which powers up the Industrial Revolution. So, Robert Burns, it is a turning point in history between the ancient and the modern. But Robert looks both ways. He soaked up the stories of the kings and queens of old, and their loves and their wars. But the bubbling ideas of the day, the rights of man and the struggle for democracy, these were things Burns thought were worth fighting for now. A great Scottish writer, Fletcher of Saltoun, he said, "If you get to write the ballads for a country, who cares who writes the laws?" It's a fantastic quote, isn't it? And that shows that it's about the power of poetry and song. And this is what Robert Burns did. With his poems and with his songs, he set down in the culture of Scotland a set of values and sympathies. Equality, the worth of a person being the stuff of their character rather than their station in life, and the sense that because we're all on this planet together, we'd better do our best to get along. And these are notions which, well, many of us Scots brought up in Burns, we hold this as an ideal for our civic and personal behaviour to this day, even when we don't quite live up to them, which of course is fairly often. Now, the blurb which went out with this talk said that I was going to reveal the arcane secret which allows those not blessed with the Scots tongue to understand the works of Robert Burns. And it's a major problem because his language is difficult. So here we go. I'm about to reveal all. Listen, everybody. Don't get too excited though, because the key to understanding Burns is, I'm afraid, hard work. Yes. Did you guess it would be? Yeah. It's like learning any language though. You plod along, you feel you're hardly making any progress, but then, suddenly, the utter joy of understanding someone speaking maybe in Spanish or Italian after a year or so of your studies, it's a fantastic thing. And I myself, I didn't understand Burns when I first came across him. I mean, I know I have a Scottish accent, but growing up in Clydebank, we probably used about 200 words which are definitely Scottish and aren't used really anywhere else. But that's only 200. And Burns's dialect, when I was a boy, it's only from 40-50 miles away from where I grew up, but it did seem to me completely foreign. So I fully understand those who speak classic English and they have massive difficulties with Burns, and they find his language quite off-putting because of that. So it's only after a lot of study and I had to convince myself that looking up words was fun. And eventually it is, because it's just become something that you do. But it was that allowed me to come to understand Burns. But don't worry, I'm not proposing that you do a lot of hard work this afternoon. I'm going to try to do that for you. So Burns's first book was called Poems, chiefly in the Scottish dialect. And it's written in Braid Scots, which is broad Scots. This is the language that was spoken all over the lowlands, from the Dark Ages, through the independence wars with England, and that took up about 600 years. Some would say they're not quite over yet. And during that time, the medieval time through to 1600, the language of the countries, England and Scotland, it grew further and further apart as the enmity between the two nations continued. And they only really began to come closer when James VI of Scotland became King of England in 1603, and further closer with the joining of the Parliaments in 1707. But in the 50 years from 1707 until Burns was born, 52 years, language may have moved towards what we recognise as English in the major cities, in Edinburgh especially. But out in the backwoods, the rural folk, well, they may have been perfectly capable of reading English, but they still spoke Scots. I'm going to give you a few scenes from Robert Burns' life to give you a picture of the man. I'll give you the dates, but for those of you who don't really think in historical timelines, I'll also give you the age which Robert was at the time. And it gives you a better sense of, we can relate ages to, I was like that when I was that age. And then I learnt that, and by that time I knew more and acted differently. So I'm going to start when Robert is 16 years old in Kirkoswald in 1775. Kirkoswald is a little village down near Ayr. And his father has paid for him to be schooled for a few weeks, a couple of months, by Hugh Roger, a master of both mathematics and biting sarcasm. I think we've all had a few teachers like that. In fact, I do remember a teacher. I bought a new diary when I was at school, and the teacher said to me, it was just a little thing, a little diary, and the teacher said, I see you've got a mini diary, Cairns. That'll be suitable for a mini brain. Thank you very much, yeah. That sort of encouragement that allowed me to grow into what I am today, But anyway, so Hugh Roger, mathematics and technical subjects. And at this time, Kirkoswald, it's all smugglers and brigands living down there, from the Isle of Man and from Ireland. And there still is a certain element of smugglers and brigandry in the area, because that's where Donald Trump has his hotel, And that's the Turnberry Golf Hotel down there, just next to Kirkoswald. Robert saw the ruffians of Kirkoswald, as he writes, in scenes of swaggering riot and roaring dissipation. Robert does claim to have joined in and learned to have looked with equanimity at a huge tavern bill. But he was only 16 at the time, and he may have been boasting. No, Robert did apply himself diligently to his studies until he caught sight of the young girl who lived next door to the school. This is a repeating theme for Robert. And he writes, the remaining week I did nothing but craze my soul or steal out at night to meet her. Yes, I'm afraid Robert's trigonometry was never the same again. And as he wrote, green grow the rashes o', the sweetest hours that e'er I spent were spent among the lasses o'. Irvine, 1781. Robert is 22 years old. He's left his father's farm for a time and gone to the town to work in the business of heckling flax. Now you'll need that explained, almost all of you. I'm sure somebody knows, but heckling flax. Flax is the plant from which you produce linseed oil, and heckling is the process by which you strip the plant down to the essential part from which you get the oil. So this is the business Robert is in. It doesn't go well though. He writes, my partner was a scoundrel of the first water who made money by the mystery of thieving. And while we were carousing at New Year, our shop, by the carelessness of the fellow's wife, took fire and was burnt to ashes, and left me like a true poet, not worth sixpence. Yes, Robert was learning fast. Poets are born, not paid. 1784, Lochlee Farm. Robert is 25 years old. His father is ill, broken by years of litigation about the lease for his land. The owners of the property have unrealistic ideas about what can be achieved with the poor soil, and they want more money than the Burns family can squeeze out of the stony ground. Robert, with the weight of the world on his shoulders, is ploughing in the fields one day when he turns over a mouse's nest, and he writes his famous poem, To a Mouse. It should be popping up in front of you. There it is. There it is. Let me guide you through it, because the language is tricky. So, that's the whole poem. It's not particularly long. I'm going to try and concentrate on the first verse and second verse. Here it is. I hope you can all see that fine. So, I'm going to read you the poem, and I'll explain it to you as we do. Wee sleeket, cowering, timorous beastie. Right, cowering. Cowering. That's cowering. Cowering. And timorous means fearful. Sleeket. Well, that's crafty, slippery, sly. You would call someone sleeket someone who maybe got their own way by sneaky means. So, wee sleeket, cowering, timorous beastie. Oh, what a panic's in thy breastie, in thy breast. Thou need na start a war sae hasty. Thou need not flee so hastily. With bicker and brattle, with frantic squeaks and rustlings. I would be loath to run and chase thee. I would be loath to run and chase thee. With murder and pattle. Pattle, a mixture of patois and prattle. So, with murderous oaths and curses. So that's the first verse. Burns is a man who talks to animals. He's a farmer. And on some long days in the fields, there's no one else to speak to but his horse, his dog, the odd cow, and today, this mouse. And Burns addresses the animals very much like we do our pets, in a mishmash of mock serious sing-song. Wee sleeket, cowering, timorous beastie. Oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. But in the second verse, he switches to the perfect Augustan English of the day. I'm truly sorry, man's dominion has broken nature's social union, and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. So, he's voicing his regret that him and his doings, that's man's dominion, has broken nature's social union, the connected web of the natural world, and justifies that ill opinion. So he's saying he understands why the mouse doesn't think much of the man, which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion. Burns is pointing out that he's just a cog in nature's wheel too, and fellow mortal. So, I'm just going to put up the next share, next page. So he's done one verse in Scots, the next not. Just let me find the next two. The next two stanzas, here they are. He's done one verse in Scots, the next not. Why? Well, what's Burns up to? And this is often the question that people put. Why doesn't he just write in plain English all the time, so everyone can understand him? Well, stultified speechifying is not the way we talk to our animals, nor to our pals and our neighbours in many cases. And Burns has this whole Ayrshire lexicon of lively words and phrases in his armoury. So that's what he uses next. I doubt na whiles, but thou may thieve. I doubt not, sometimes, that thou may well steal. I mean, that's what mice do. What then, poor beastie? Thou mun live. What of it? You must live. A daemon icker in a thrave. Now, that line is about as deep as dialect gets. And if you don't understand it, I wouldn't worry. You're in good company. Not very many people would these days, even in remotest rural Ayrshire. So what does it mean? Well, daemon means occasional. An icker, it's an ear of corn, and a thrave, that's 12 sheaves of corn. So what he's actually saying is, listen, mouse, if you steal the odd ear of corn from a sheaf, it's a small request. It's a small request. I'll get a blessing with a lave. I'll get the benefit of the rest and never miss it. He looks again at the mouse's nest, which the plough has turned over. Thou wee bit housey, do and ruin. So that your wee house, its silly was, the winds are strewn. Its fragile walls are being shredded by the wind. And nothing now to big a new one, and nothing now to build from again. Or foliage green. So there's no leaves and stems for the mouse to gather at this end of the autumn. And bleak December winds ensuing, both snell and keen. Snell. Well, that's cold. A nippy, biting cold. We do have a lot of different words in Scotland for various types of cold. The next verse. Let's find you the next verse. So this is number 3. Here we go. Next 2 stanzas. Thou saw the fields laid bare and waste, and weary winter coming fast, and cosy here beneath the wind. Burns's farm was high in the Ayrshire moors, about 400 feet up, with barely a tree standing between his front door and the broad Atlantic. So he often refers to the wind as a blast. He did know what he was talking about. Cosy here, thou thought to dwell, till crash, the cruel coulter passed. The coulter is the ploughshare, the blade of the plough. Out through thy cell, out through your little den. Now, in the next verse, he sympathises with the mouse again, slightly facetiously this time. That wee bit heap o' leaves and stubble, that's stubble, has cost thee mony a weary nibble. A weary nibble, as if the mouse gets as tired as work as the ploughman does at his. Now thou's turned out for a' thy trouble, but house or hold, from household, to thole the winter's sleety dribble. Thole. It's a lovely word, still in use every day here in Scotland. And to thole means to put up with things, to put up with whatever comes your way, especially if it's not exactly what you were wishing for. That's when you have to thole it. Yeah. To thole the winter's sleety dribble, and cranrach called. Now the cranrach, that's quite a specific word. The cranrach is it's a sort of low creeping mist that comes in after an early winter sunset, probably bringing with it the hoarfrost, which settles on plants and fields and the grasses and everything. And cranrach called. Time now for the next share. This is number 4 in my images. Just gotta find it. There it is. And this is the last 2 verses. The mouse has now scuttled off into the hedgerow to seek other shelter, leaving Burns alone in the muddy ridges of his half-ploughed field. But Mousie, thou art know thy lane, but you're not on your own, Mouse. Improving foresight may be vain. And now, here comes the famous line, quoted the world over. The best laid schemes of mice and men, gang after gley, go often awry. And lee us not, but grief and pain, and leave us nothing but grief and pain, for promised joy, when we'd hoped for pleasure. The light's fading. The empathy and the fun of the moment of speaking to the mouse is dwindling, and Robert finishes off. Still, thou art blessed compared with me. The present only toucheth thee. But all-purpose Scottish expression, very, very popular. It's usually said with a resigned shake of the head. But I backward cast my eye on prospects drear. So the past has been all trouble and hard work for Robert. And forward though I cannot see, I guess and fear. I'm just going to take the share off. I'm going to try to anyway. There it is. So you can see me again. Hopefully that's me back on the screen. Are you all still with me? I hope you are, yeah? I hope that was helpful. And if I've insulted people who know this stuff inside out, well, I'm very sorry, you know, but personally, to have Burns explain to me in the way that I've tried to do, I find it helpful even now because, as I said, many of those terms, especially the farming ones from the rural areas, from 18th century farming, these are foreign terms to me. So To a Mouse was written a couple of years before Robert began to make a success of being a poet. He was working hard at his writing, but he had never yet been published, just circulating a few handwritten copies around his friends. And their response was very enthusiastic. And some clever people locally were saying, this is the coming man. But Burns still had nagging doubts about the worth of his poems. And the farm was in deep trouble. The long court case over the matter was sapping the will of the whole family. Eviction was a possibility. And Robert's younger brother, John, was dying, aged only 16. And for all his own personal charm and his good looks, Robert was continually hard up. And to the local farm girls, amongst whom he was keen to find a wife, I'm afraid he didn't at this point look much of a catch. So, dark days indeed. But as he considers the plight of the mouse he's accidentally ousted, Burns he rises above his own woes and cares and expresses his fellow feeling. For all creatures mired in tough circumstances, no matter how wee, sleekit, cowering or timorous a beastie they happen to be. So, would Robert Burns' friends and family at the time fully understand the language he used in his poems? Just about, but not wholly. The specific terms for natural things, I mean, cranrach, foggage, whiles for sometimes, a gley for a rye, they would be in general use. But the thing about Burns is he was an inveterate collector of interesting words. Cranrach, that comes from the Gaelic, a completely different language from English. And Robert's father was from rural Kincardineshire, in the northeast of Scotland, where they speak the Doric dialect. And Robert throws in words from there. In other poems, he'll select French terms when it suits him, like cotillon or ragout. And when he finds himself finishing a line with decorum, he nails down the couplet by rhyming it in pure Latin with the term variorum, a variety. So, Robert Burns in his writing, he uses a larger vocabulary than Shakespeare. Yes. And in fact, that's the thickness of Robert's book, his work. And as we know, Shakespeare wrote a whole shelf. It's a remarkable thing. So his language is not just an arcane rural dialect. It's the vivid cut and paste of his local patois, his learned reading, and his voracious delight in expressive words wherever he found them. So no one ever spoke the language of Robert Burns, except Robert himself. He's very similar to Chaucer in that respect. I'm going to go back now and do 2 or 3 more scenes from his life before we finish off. How are we doing for time? Pretty good. Should be in about 40 minutes total. Tarbolton, 1786. Robert is 27. Bess Peyton, one of the farm girls, has had his child out of wedlock. And so has Jean Armour. And Jean's father, yes, I see the ladies going, oh my God, what sort of toe rag is this guy? I'm not going to hide the worst side of him. He had a bad side from time to time. We'll try to understand it, and you must make up your own mind about the man. So Jean's father has issued writs against Robert to seize any monies he thinks he might be hiding. And the farm is no more profitable than ever. But Robert has a wild plan to escape it all and take a boat to the West Indies to work as a bookkeeper in the plantations. He's made contacts and he's got a position actually lined up waiting for him out there. But before his ship sails, he gets a printer in Kilmarnock to rattle off an edition of his poems, 650 copies. And you know what? It is a massive success. He writes, old and young, high and low, grave and gay, learned or ignorant, all were alike delighted, agitated, transported. Change of plans. There may be a future for Robert in old Scotland yet. And so to Edinburgh, 1787. This is Robert's miracle year. He's 28 years old, and he rides in from Ayrshire on a borrowed pony, clip-clopping up the Cowgate, staring with wide-eyed country boy wonder at the tall buildings and the bustle and noise of the city. But within a week, he's the talk of the town. The Duchess of Glencairn, the Duchess of Gordon, Lord Glencairn, Dalrymple of Orangefield, all these important people have him to their soirees. And they're both inspired by his poetry and charmed by his skill in conversation. William Creech, a prominent bookseller, offers to act as his agent for another edition for a few thousand copies, and the subscribers flood in. Burns has suddenly enough money to live the high life, but also to send enough back to his brother Gilbert to completely pay off the debts of the farm. Edinburgh again, next year, 1788. At a genteel tea party in Edinburgh with the teacups clinking, Robert meets a vivacious young woman called Agnes MacIlhose, separated from her husband. And for Robert, it's falling in love again. Yes, I'm afraid he's smitten. But they both are, and they can't get enough of each other. They meet at Agnes's house a number of times. At the first couple of times, Burns brings along a pal to act as chaperone. But the pal gets bored with the lovebirds swooning at each other, and soon he slopes off and leaves them to it. So, is decorum observed? Or do Robert and Agnes fall to the temptation of delicious sin? I'm afraid we don't quite know. The letters are fairly explicit, but they're not that explicit. We can guess, though, that Robert's advances may have been frustrated with Agnes, but maybe not quite so much with her maid. he did get her maid pregnant. Yes, Jenny Clow. Yeah, I think Robert Burns, his rather shady reputation with the ladies does have some merit in it. But the author in him observes his own behaviour. And he does write from the woman's point of view. Let me just reach for the quote here. With lightsome heart I pulled a rose, full sweet, upon its thorny tree. But my false lover stole my rose, and he left the thorn with me. Dumfriesshire, 1788. Robert is 29. A friend has offered him Ellisland Farm, and realising that he was only ever going to be flavour of the year in fashionable Edinburgh, Robert had been keeping an eye out for a more regular way of making money than poetry. And within 10 days of him writing that song and declaring his undying love for Agnes MacIlhose, what's the rogue done? He's nipped across the country, been to Glasgow, bought a wedding present, down to Ayrshire and married Jean Armour. Yes. Her father is not quite so against him now that he's a famous poet with a fair amount of money. And they set up house with their children and a few of Robert's bastard wains as well. Jean is mysteriously understanding about this sort of thing. And Robert, who plays the fiddle very well, he started collecting old Scots songs. Songs falling out of fashion, songs banned after the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite Rebellion. Because when the English won at Culloden, the wearing of the tartan was banned, the speaking of the Gaelic was banned, the playing of the bagpipes and the fiddle. So Scots song was in serious trouble. Robert improves a lot of the ancient songs. He reworks many of them, sets others to different tunes, many to Gaelic tunes. And these are published by Thomson of Edinburgh, 370 of them. Burns single-handedly saves Scots music and song from oblivion. And many of these pieces are very soon given new settings by the great composers of Europe, by Mendelssohn and by Beethoven. Although with Beethoven, I love Beethoven, but I have to say that his version of Duncan Gray is not necessarily an improvement on the very danceable, the very jaunty original which Burns created. He adds lots of pomp and ceremony, but you wouldn't dance a reel to it, you know. Dumfries, 1791. Robert is in his 30s now. When Ellisland Farm didn't work out, he found a job involving slightly less hard graft as an exciseman, a tax inspector, and he moved into the town. He has to ride round the countryside in all weathers though, but he works in his songs and his poems between the beat of his horse's hooves. He doesn't say on the beat, he says between the beat. He's a master of counterpoint. It's wonderful. And it's about this time that Burns writes his masterpiece, Tam O'Shanter. I'm going to share the screen again, some images. Tam O'Shanter. And just to let you know, I'll start explaining a couple of things again, just before we finish off. Tam O'Shanter, what does it mean? It means Tom, Thomas, of Shanter Farm. Tom of Shanter Farm. Country folk are often known by the names of the places where they live. I mean, Robert himself, when he lived at Mossgiel Farm, he referred to himself as Rob Mossgiel. Tam O'Shanter is the roistering tale of a man in town for market day, and that's the image we see in front of us. And these images which I'm showing you, this is a series of fantastic paintings by Sandy Gowdy, done in the late 1980s, illustrating Tam O'Shanter. And wonderful, I saw them in Kirkcudbright Museum about 5 or 6 years ago. It's a wonderful exploration of the whole poem. I'll just do the next share, see if you can find you. So when Tam O'Shanter, there he is with his horse, he's an Ayrshire worthy, he's in town on business at market day, but when market day is over, he feels no great compunction to hurry home. In fact, instead, if I can find the image, Where is it? I don't see it yet. I'll just go to another one that I can find then, eh? Here he is. He goes to the pub. There he is in the pub in the corner. And there with his pal, Suitor Johnny, Shoemaker Johnny, he gets foo and unca happy, which means full and extraordinarily happy. Extraordinary. I sound a bit like Billy Connolly there. He says extraordinary all the time, doesn't he? Yeah. So, but Tam O'Shanter is getting extraordinarily happy. Again in this poem, he switches between broad Scots. He has the term fast by an ingle, bleezing finely, which means tight in a corner by a roaring fire. With reaming swats that drank divinely, and that means with foaming ale that went down very well. But then he'll switch from his Scots into purest English again. And in the same poem he says, "But pleasures are like poppies spread. You seize the flower, the bloom is shed." And here we see the young couple picking poppies and no doubt enjoying other pleasures in the fields. So, Tam O'Shanter goes to the pub after his market day, and then he sets out for home. Where's the picture of him setting out for home? Let me just find this. Here he is, crossing the bridge. There he is in his blue hat, crossing the bridge in air. The howling storm and lightning breaking over his head, standing between him and Shanter Farm. And as he approaches Alloway Kirk, and Alloway Kirk is Alloway Church, an ancient ruined kirkyard or churchyard, he sees something through the storm in the black of the night at midnight. Sees something that he shouldn't see, something strange. There's lights on in the ruined kirk, and he pushes his horse further forward to have a look. In the ruined windows, this spooky, eerie light appearing. And he listens. And he thinks he can hear. He thinks he can hear. Well, I'm not actually going to tell you what he thinks he can hear, because I think the best way for people to learn more about Tam O'Shanter is to come on the Travel Editions tour, which was in June this year, and also another one in September. And on the Saturday morning, it's a weekend tour. You arrive on Friday night, and we're through till Sunday evening. On the Saturday morning, the first place we visit is Alloway Kirkyard, where Tam O'Shanter met his fate, which some of you will know perfectly well, and others you'll have to you have to come on the tour to find out. Other things that we'll be doing on the tour, I'll just go off the share so you can see me. Hopefully that's me appearing on the screen now. Other things we'll be doing on the tour, it's a bit of a treat, the whole thing. We're going to the cottage where Burns was born, now a museum, and the large birthplace museum next door. And it's a beautiful little corner of Alloway at the outskirts of Ayr, and we'll see the flying bridge, the high flying bridge over the River Doon, and right in the centre of where Burns was born and grew up. In the afternoon we go to Burns's house in Mauchline village, where he set up with Jean Armour. And on the Saturday evening, it wouldn't be a Burns weekend without a Burns supper, would it? And you're getting a treat, you're getting haggis. I take it everybody considers haggis a treat. Haggis and whiskey, and we'll also, at a Burns supper, there are a few chances to speak, and one of the big things is that anybody can speak. So anybody who wishes to may stand up and read a poem by Robert Burns or sing a song by Burns. And if you don't do it, well, I suppose I'll have to do them. So that's the Saturday night. On the Sunday we visit Ellisland Farm down in Dumfriesshire, and the little hermitage hut which Robert was gifted by a rich friend for peace and quiet to sit and write in. And we have lunch in Dumfries at the Globe Inn, which is very, very similar to the way it was in 1790. The menu's changed, you know. But this is the place where Robert used to repair for a libation after a hard day at the Ink and Quill. And it was so popular, it was so often there, he had his own bedroom. And so we'll visit the Globe Inn, and then in the afternoon we will visit the great, the mausoleum, the monument to Robert Burns, which the town of Dumfries erected to Scotland's national bard. And there we will consider what Robert Burns has left to us all. History. Living history. And immortal poetry. Thank you very much. Now I hope somebody will ask me a question. I can't possibly have given you everything you need to know. I'll hand over back to Ellen now.
Thank you so much, Robin. And you didn't just have a bit of Billy Connolly there. I picked up a bit of Sean Connery when we got to
Sean
the
Connery!
There was
Show us some
definitely
steak.
That's it. That's my man, Sean.
Ellen is operating from the other side of the country, in Edinburgh, and
Yes,
I'm on.
I'm the Edinburgh.
We look to our own heroes here.
Well, there's only one James Bond in this world, and that James Bond was and forever will be Sean Connery. So, no, seriously, thank you very, very much. That was fantastic. Excellent. Thank you, Robin. Now, I've got some comments before we go to questions. First of all, from Barb Stewart over in Canada, who will shortly be over here as she starts doing some travel editions tours again. She says that it was simply lovely, Robin, and she gets it, and getting over her lifelong fear of taking on more burns.
Good.
And then Carolyn says, great talk, Robin, inspiring delivery, both informative and entertaining. Looking forward to the Mary Queen of Scots tour in September. Well, you can also look forward to a Mary Queen of Scots talk as well, Carolyn, because we've just agreed that, haven't we? Yes.
It's June, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Oh yes, that's a good question. I like this one. Is there a dictionary of these words for English illiterates?
Well, it's hardly illiterate if you speak English. No, there are Scots English dictionaries. Yes. Broad Scots, and you'll also find dictionaries of local dialects like the Doric. These will be available on Amazon and in bookshops, no doubt. You can certainly buy them in bookshops in Scotland, but I think if you're elsewhere, you're probably better going to Amazon. But these are very comprehensive. I've got a Scots dictionary that's fully 3.5 inches thick, which just shows you the sheer number of Scottish terms, often rural terms, which nobody will ever need to use again. But because those ways of cultivating farming have gone. But no, they do exist, yes.
Fabulous, thank you. And I think Amazon probably is the best bet, because there's not a lot you can't find on Amazon.
Indeed.
And it's next day delivery most of the time. And there's some more comments as well. But just before I cover that, has anybody got any questions? And if you have got a question, please unmute. Just wave at me and unmute, and then ask your question. Any questions? Yes, Joe Edwards. Can you Joe, you'll need to unmute.
Someone else is already on.
I'll come back to you, William. We'll just get Joe. Yeah, we'll just get Joe on. That's it. Joe's unmuted. Fire away, Joe, first.
I just wondered if his poems were read in England at the time or shortly afterwards, or was there a time they became popular down south?
Yes. The first Burns Club was in Sunderland. So that was already, that's 1804, 1805, so only 7-8 years after his death. His poetry was read in London at the time, yes. People obviously went out their way, to understand it. I think one of the remarkable things about Burns is so few poets of any quality were writing in any dialect. Yeah, I mean, once the standardization of language has not fully happened in the 1780s, 1790s. That's a Victorian thing when spelling was agreed. I mean, Robert spells different words differently in different places in his own poetry, you know, and that's just the way. If you look at Chaucer, you can just see how it's a mixture of the phonetic and whatever languages he's come under the influence of. You know. So yes, it was read in England. Obviously. It's a lot more popular in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Russia, China, India, Brazil than he is in England. But and in fact in Japan, at every undergraduate ceremony, when they graduate, they always sing Auld Lang Syne, which is of course is by Robert Burns, and Japanese students don't always know why they're singing it, but they'll maybe come across it later in life, or if they're visiting Britain, and they find out that they've been sent out into the world with this thought that should all acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind, you know, and what a tragic thing would that be, you know, if that was done. It's a wonderful sentiment, and he's known all over the world. But I mean, many quotations from Burns are still used in English, of Mice and Men, you know, which is obviously the Steinbeck novel as well, and but the singing of Auld Lang Syne is very popular in England too. Yeah.
What about My Love Is Like a Red, Red Rose?
Beautiful song, absolutely.
One of the most, Kenneth McKellar. That's yes. Does that? I know we're sort of getting quite sentimental here. Does that answer it for you, Joe?
Thank you.
Thank you. William, you're next. Yes, please.
Yeah, Robert Burns lived through the American and French Revolution, so presumably he was not only interested in them, but influenced by them too, possibly.
Oh yes, yes. The French, the 1776, Robert is 16 years old when the American Revolution takes place. But what happened was it meant that Britain was at war with America, and there were American pirate ships operating in British waters, and you could see them from Robert's farm. They were operating up to Ailsa Craig, which is the giant volcanic rock in the middle of the Firth of Clyde. So they were taking ships. The Americans were attacking ships in the Firth of Clyde, operating out of New York or wherever. So, and also with the French Revolution, Robert was utterly sympathetic to the ideals of both the American and the French Revolution. But again, it meant that Britain was at war with France. So there was no revolution that took place in Robert's lifetime which did not result in his own country being opposed, you know, in battle with the original country in which the revolutions had happened. So for that, he's massively conflicted, because he wasn't like many of us. He was patriotic, not just for Scotland but for Britain, and it produced conflict in him. And some of his more radical work, which he wrote in the final years of his life, he didn't actually publish. It's in his letters, because with being at war with France, expressing sympathy for the French Revolution, people were being transported to Australia for the same offence at the time.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, thank you. William, does that answer as best as possible?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Sally? Yes, Sally next, please.
It's not so much a question as just an observation. I was trying to type it and I can't do it. Anyway, I know a little bit about, or I knew a little bit about Robert Burns, and I just absolutely loved your talk, because now I know more about it than just the bit John Steinbeck pinched, which I know that novel really, really well, and I just loved it. And thank you so much. I'm going to find out more and think about it more. And you've really cheered my afternoon. I loved your presentation, and you've got a very nice guitar.
Yeah.
Oh yes, yeah.
I was waiting for you to start a tune, actually, Robin. I was hoping you were going to sort of like serenade us.
So that's
Maybe
it, really.
you need to come on the tour for that. You need to come on the tour.
I live in Dorset.
Sorry?
I live in Dorset.
Well, that's what touring's about, going to other places.
I think it's easier to go to Europe than Scotland from where I live.
I have a friend who lives in Glasgow, and she is back and forth to Dorset to see her mum. And she got marooned down there during the storms about 3 weeks ago. It took about 10 days to get back. You know?
Oh wow, yes. I landed in the storms into Edinburgh during one of the storms and had aborted landings and yes. Edinburgh airport's bad on a good day. This was one of the worst I've ever had in all my life. Anyway. So yes, so thank you very much, Sally, and thank you for such lovely comments as well. That's fantastic. Excellent, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or any comments? I do see Laura Armitage has just popped a note in saying thank you for the lovely talk, and best wishes to the lovely Karen as well, because she was on your Charles Rennie Mackintosh tour last September, and Karen is Robin's lovely wife, for anyone who doesn't know. Okay. Oh yes, does somebody have a question there?
Yes, Ellen, this is Peter.
Hello, Peter. Sorry, there you are. I can see you.
I don't know how to put the waving hand up. Robin, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. And I did write you a little note to say that I go up to Scotland a lot, especially in the Applecross area.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel now a little bit more equipped. I think I'm going to be less timid to face the locals in the Applecross Inn, because now I feel I've got a little bit of knowledge. So thank you very, very much indeed for that.
Applecross are a different breed up there.
Well, that brings me to my question, which is in Burns' time, let alone what goes on now, I mean, essentially he's an Ayrshire man.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any regional differences? Were there any people that were slightly curmudgeon about him who weren't from the Ayrshire region? Do you know what I'm saying there? Was he in his day throughout Scotland universally loved, or do you have slight kinds of factions? Maybe the people in the Applecross area going, oh, well, he's not from here.
No, there is no regional faction that turned against Robert. I tell you what, though, he was an obnoxious young brute at times, and he didn't mind noising up the locals. And the things he said about the local ministers of the church, you know, I mean, he named them and lampooned them. You know, if I did the same in my own little world here in Glasgow, my name would be well, everybody would be talking about me. But no, he really had a few people who hated him. He had one chap who wrote doggerel against him, and he had a good pal called David Siller, who was a poet too. And David realised that he was totally outclassed, and he's a bit wry about it at times. But no, he didn't turn against Robert. Robert was extraordinarily fortunate. He was the rock star poet of his time. This hadn't happened before in Britain. It hadn't happened in Europe. You know, I mean, Dante, he was exiled from Florence for writing. You know, but Burns is feted and becomes a man of a man that everybody turned to, and he knew who he wanted to be. He set himself out when he was a young man. He used to write about wanting to be a bardie, to be a bard, or a bardie being a sort of diminutive version of the word. You know, like saying, I'm going to be a big rocky star, me, you know. But he set out to become it, and he did manage it. But it's that thing about fame. As humans, we can't tolerate too many famous people. It has to be for a few, otherwise it's not special.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Robin. That was a very good way of putting it at the end, actually. I've got a question from Barb Stewart for you, Robin, on
Yes.
the chat box. She asks, how did aristocracy embracing Burns handle the humanist and egalitarian and nationalist content of his work?
Okay. Right. Well, he was feted. It was Lord Glencairn, really, who he had lands in the Loudon area of Ayrshire. And when the first edition came out, the Kilmarnock edition of his poems, the 650, paid for by Burns and his pals by crowdfunding, Glencairn picked this up, passed his name to Thomas Blacklock, the blind poet in Edinburgh. He passed it to Henry Fielding, who wrote a review in Blackwood's magazine. And when he didn't walk into Edinburgh blind, they knew he was coming, and many people in Edinburgh had seen the first edition, and he was feted by so many. He was very, very grateful, especially to Glencairn. When Glencairn died an early death, Robert wrote that it was just impossible to quantify what this one man had done for a poor wight like himself, just a poor rhymer, as he put it. But there is a clash there, of course, in being feted by the aristocracy. And as Robert grew up, I think he was a bit chippy. He did not expect to be treated with great respect by those of great stature and grander people than him. He expected to be looked down upon a bit, and he was ready for it. And if it didn't happen, it surprised him. But in general, as he went on, it didn't happen. They treated him very, very well. They saw his gifts and his talents. I will say, though, that the Duchess of Gordon, a great wit and a bit of a scandalous woman in her time, she's a great character. When she was 18, her and her sister rode down the Royal Mile on the back of a pair of pigs. Just for a laugh, in Edinburgh. And she was apparently she had the most foul mouth on her. A cultivated lady, very well educated, but she came out with the most incredible things. Everyone at the dinner party would go, "Oh my goodness, are you allowed to say that?" And the thing, I think Burns ran up against her in a way because Robert was not used to educated women. None of the women he bedded could really read in his whole lifetime, if you don't include Agnes MacLehose, where we don't know whether they got that far or not. So there is an element to any young man who has not grown up with educated women is bound to find himself set in his heels when he finds when he engages in debate with them, and that has been a large learning process, and possibly not one which Robert quite got over. There's a mildly scandalous episode from later in his life with Elizabeth Riddle, the wife of Captain Riddle, which you'll need to come on the tour for me to tell you about that. Hopefully that
touch there,
answers the
Robin.
question. It's a very good question, and it's one for well, I can't answer it just like that. It's got sides to it.
Thank you, Robin. I hope that part answers and gives you some indication, Barb. Okay, does anybody else have any other questions?
Yes.
Oh, hello, John.
Hi. Can I just say, I think that was one of the great speeches. I agree with everything that Sally said there. It was just terrific, absolutely engaging from start to finish, and so educational in a fun way. It was really, really great.
Great.
I liked very much at the start you said that Robbie Burns had talked about a man's worth, I think it was or something, a man's worth depended on their character rather than on their standing, or similar words to that.
Yes.
He liked what the revolutionaries were doing in America and in France. Was there any fear among the aristocracy? I mean, did they take him into account at all? Were they afraid about somebody with such power of words talking about character as opposed to standing and maybe wealth and that sort of thing, or did it not get that far?
Well, it as I said earlier, I think in his poems and in the early part of his career, the aristocracy treated him very well, and if they were, you know, they took on board the idea. I mean, just as people low in society have to make a move towards respecting themselves more, so by new ideas, people who have continually lorded it for centuries have a new perception of looking at the people around them. There was a part of it was the Masonic movement, of which Robert joined when he was 21-year-old, and in the Masons, that's where he met Lord Glencairn. But the laird and the tenant farmer stood next to each other and debated on in the Masons at that time. It wasn't. I don't know if I'm speaking to many Masons. I don't certainly want to insult people, but there is an element to the Masons, especially in the west of Scotland, which is rather. It can edge towards bigotry and anti-Catholic bigotry. But in this era, this does not seem to have been the case. In fact, there were Catholics in the Masons, especially in Italy. Yeah.
Very interesting.
So, I sort of answered your question. Later in life, Robert held his guns back on the revolutionary stuff. It's in his letters, but it's not in his published work. He knew the consequences. I can't remember the chap's name offhand, but there was a prominent person speaking out for the French revolutionary ideas who was transported to Australia and spread them there.
Good, thank you.